the International Space Station suddenly encountered a collision with an unidentified object. Astronauts ventured outside the spacecraft for repairs. To their surprise, they discovered that the object that collided with the space station was actually the corpse of a Soviet woman from several decades ago. When the astronauts returned to Earth after resolving the crisis, everything around them had changed. This is the latest sci-fi series we will be discussing this time, titled Constellation. On a stormy night, a mother and daughter were traveling in the outskirts. A hoarse female voice kept coming from the radio, sounding like Russian. Suddenly, a police car followed closely behind them, driven by a nervous-looking woman who occasionally glanced at an unknown device beside her. Fortunately, the police car was just passing by. Shortly after, the woman parked the car at a roadside cottage, where a portrait of an angel hung in the living room. After settling her child, the woman hid the unknown device in the warehouse. Just then, a call of her daughter came from deep within the forest, leaving the woman feeling somewhat puzzled. Her daughter was inside the house, so the woman ventured into the depths of the forest to uncover the truth. 5 weeks ago, the woman named Jo was a female astronaut, having a video call with her young daughter from the space station. They had only 84 days left until they could reunite, which excited Jo greatly. She brought her tablet near the airlock, intending to show her daughter the full view of the Earth. Unexpectedly, her colleague John activated the cold atom device, causing the entire space station to undergo violent movements. They lost contact with the California laboratory, and John lost his balance amidst the intense shaking. An iron rod pierced through his arm, and Jo shouted for caution, as the spacecraft suffered breaches with debris scattered everywhere. Fortunately, communication was restored shortly after, and the ground control center ordered the crew to seal the entrance, and immediately gather at the Soyuz 1 evacuation capsule, initiating the evacuation procedures. However, the fire blocked the passage to Soyuz 1. They had to go to the Dawn experiment module for assembly first. During that time, something collided with the space station. Jo and her partner Eric tried their best to extinguish the fire, and then shut down the service module's pressurization system. The astronauts managed to stabilize the situation with great difficulty. When they counted the people, they realized John was missing. Jo and Helen immediately went back to find him. It turned out that the iron rod had pinned John in place, rendering him unable to move. Helen retrieved the first aid kit to treat the wound, while the control center reminded them the space station faced severe oxygen and pressure loss issues, so they had to quickly inspect the functionality of the Soyuz 1 evacuation capsule. After the crew conducted the inspection, they discovered that Soyuz 1 evacuation capsule was damaged, and the remaining Soyuz 2 capsule had only 3 seats available, which meant only 3 out of the 5 people could evacuate. Jo and the other 2 were not disturbed by this news. They were determined to rescue John. Helen believed that the only way to free him from the situation was to amputate his arm. Jo handed over the injured person to Helen for treatment, and she and Eric went outside to repair the life support system and the damaged section of Soyuz 1. Meanwhile, the head of the California Rocket Propulsion Laboratory received the data from the cold atom experiment. It turned out that just a few seconds before the accident, John's cold atom separation experiment was successful. This experiment could only be conducted in a zero-gravity environment. A completely new state of matter exists. The head believes that even if it means risking the lives of several astronauts, the cold atom device must be brought back to Earth. On the other hand, Jo discovered that the space station's oxygen supply system and external cables were completely damaged and beyond repair. The ground control center instructed them to abort the extravehicular activity and quickly return to Earth aboard Soyuz 2. This decision was opposed by the higher-ups. In order to protect the cold atom device, they sent Jo on a risky mission to the truss structure to repair the secondary life support system. However, the camera at that location was damaged, and Jo had to make the repairs without any external assistance. She found a 50-centimeter long crack in the truss structure, and Jo intended to pull out the object causing the impact. But to her surprise, it turned out to be the body of a cosmonaut. She wanted to grab the person for identification, but the safety tether was not long enough. Jo could only report the situation to the control center. The object was a female former Soviet cosmonaut. Upon hearing this, Bonnie, a leader within the Russian space agency, showed a startled expression. Shortly after, John died, and the surgery failed. Now there are only 4 astronauts remaining. The ground control center instructed 3 astronauts to board Soyuz 2 and leave, leaving 1 person behind to repair the power system of Soyuz 1 using the command module's battery. They would then return to Earth aboard Soyuz 1. Now the life support system inside the spacecraft, it can support 1 person for 19 hours. All 4 of them know that the one left behind is the unluckiest. Jo, being the highest-ranking astronaut, decided to stay behind and repair Soyuz 1. The remaining 3 entered Soyuz 2 and separated from the space station. Jo watched her colleagues leave, feeling anxious. At this moment, the power system inside the space station is malfunctioning. relying solely on solar energy to operate. According to the orbit of the space station, there is 1 minute and 30 seconds left until it loses sunlight and becomes paralyzed. Therefore, Joe must perform the pressurization procedure as quickly as possible within this time limit. Unexpectedly, at a critical moment, Joe discovered that the necklace her daughter had given her was missing. She took a risk and went back to retrieve the necklace. After completing the pressurization, she quickly entered Soyuz 1, where there was sufficient oxygen. From now on, every 45 minutes, the orbiting space station would experience sunlight. Joe needs to enter the space station during the sunlight period, remove the batteries, and return to Soyuz 1 with oxygen before the sunlight ends to replace the batteries. At this moment, the control center delivered good news, that the 3 astronauts aboard Soyuz 2 had landed safely. Joe felt happy for them, but soon the control center presented her with another challenge. They requested Joe to bring back the cold atom device. Joe didn't immediately agree, and wanted to see if there was enough time before making a decision. The brief sunlight has already ended, and Joe continues to dismantle the batteries using the light from her tablet. Unexpectedly, there was a knocking sound inside the space station, and now Joe was the only one in the cabin with the deceased John. The eerie sound was frightening, and Joe put on her oxygen mask and went to investigate. To her surprise, the scene ahead suddenly changed, and she found herself inside a building, with her daughter's necklace hanging on the wooden door at the end. Just as Joe was about to take the necklace, her daughter's voice called out to her. The scene shifted to a stormy night, and Joe followed her daughter's voice through the snow and mist, only to come across another identical wooden house. The snowflakes were suspended in the air, as if entering a mysterious space. Joe pushed open the door with confusion, and discovered the differences between the 2 wooden houses. The paintings here were of demons instead of angels. Joe followed the knocking sound and went upstairs, where she saw the familiar necklace hanging on the cupboard. Joe quickly opened the door to check, and discovered another daughter inside. 2 wooden houses, 2 daughters. The unfolding events were perplexing. Joe picked up the daughter and returned to the wooden house with the angel painting, where she smelled a familiar scent on this daughter. Joe immediately fixed the water heater, and let the almost frozen girl take a hot bath. But she soon realized that if this child was her daughter Alice, then who was lying asleep on the bed, holding the light? Joe walked towards the bedroom, hesitating between the 2 identical children. In the end, she chose to believe in the familiar scent. Joe walked past Alice in the bedroom, ignoring her, and headed towards the bathroom. However, the child inside the bathroom was gone. Alice, who was behind her, looked perplexed. She asked her mother what she was looking for. Joe leaned in and sniffed the girl, and she could tell that the scent on her didn't belong to her own daughter.
Where is she?
The next moment, Joe woke up from the space station, and realized that she had been unconscious for several hours. She saw that there were only 6 hours and 45 minutes left on the life support system. Joe set aside her doubts and increased her repair speed. At that moment, a white head covering floated over. Joe shone her flashlight on it, and discovered that John's body had opened its eyes. Joe floated over and cautiously tested John's breath. Once she confirmed that he was completely dead, she covered his head again with the head covering. The dark spacecraft was silent. Joe recorded her final words for her daughter while changing the batteries. Unexpectedly, a noisy sound erupted. Joe played back the recording to identify its content.
Stop breathing, John. You stay in destiny.
This is John's voice. Joe hurried back to confirm the body. She discovered a severed hand floating outside the airlock. In the moment she held the hand, she saw John come back to life, but the scene in front of her quickly vanished, and Joe suspected that she had hallucinated due to low oxygen levels. She needed to leave this place as soon as possible. With only 90 minutes left, the batteries of Soyuz 1 were finally replaced. However, there was a malfunction in the S-band, and Joe couldn't contact the control center. She couldn't obtain the orbital parameters, and without them, there was no course of action. There was a high possibility that Soyuz 1 would crash into the city center, potentially killing hundreds of people. Fortunately, Joe had strong mental resilience. She immediately referenced the data left by Escape Pod 2, and calculated the orbital parameters herself. The power of being a top student was invincible, and Joe successfully simulated a set of data. She also retrieved the cold atom device. Joe had done everything she could. She threw the tablet containing her last words into the space station, and initiated the separation procedure for Soyuz 2. Unexpectedly, the bolt system had another issue, and it required 2 crew members to work together to fix it. Where could Joe find a second person? Was she really going to lose her life here? The life support system entered its final countdown, and the control center personnel didn't receive any data feedback. They believed Joe was undoubtedly going to die. Unexpectedly, another miracle occurred. A shadow approached the unmanned control button. and helped Joe fix the malfunction. Soyuz 1 slowly detached from the space station. It was estimated that it would take 3 hours and 20 minutes to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. The control center captured the signal immediately and contacted her right away. At the moment they heard Joe's voice, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. Soyuz 2 landed on a ballistic trajectory, and its landing location couldn't be confirmed. The control center dispatched personnel to search any location within a 300-kilometer radius. Meanwhile, Joe's escape pod plummeted like a missile and crashed into an open area. After a period of time, she woke up from unconsciousness. Joe unfastened her face mask and took deep breaths of oxygen. She opened the hatch and was about to climb out when a hungry wolf approached slowly. At the critical moment, a gunshot rang out, and it turned out to be the timely arrival of the Russian search and rescue team. Medical personnel placed Joe on a stretcher, and Alice and her father appeared in a helicopter. Joe was immersed in joy and didn't notice that her husband had an odd expression. Meanwhile, Gene, the head of the rocket propulsion lab, hurriedly went to the cabin to retrieve the cold atom device. He immediately activated the system, and the atomic setup emitted a faint glow. The next moment, Alice realized that her mother was gone, and she was alone in the vast plane. Joe encountered the same situation. Before she could react, her husband and daughter reappeared. The previous situation felt like a dream. After Joe said a sentence in Swedish, she leaned tiredly against the window to rest. She didn't see the puzzled look on her husband's and daughter's faces. The scene shifted back to that snowy night. Joe believed that the girl who disappeared in the bathtub was the real Alice, so she called fake Alice, and together they rushed into the forest to find her daughter. Fake Alice left bead markers along the way, and she couldn't help but remind Joe there was no other cabin ahead. People who have been to outer space can experience hallucinations. Perhaps that cabin was just your imagination. But Joe told the little girl, "I don't think you are my daughter."
But if I'm not, then who are you?
Let's go back to the storyline where Joe was rescued. With one press conference after another waiting ahead, reporters were asking about the cause of the accident, and Joe was about to answer truthfully when her colleague Mark interrupted. He stated that they wouldn't jump to conclusions before the investigation results were released, because the incident occurred at the International Space Station. It involved multiple countries such as the United States, Russia, Canada, and Japan. Mark did this to be cautious. After the press conference, Joe went to console John's wife.
Erica, I'm so sorry. Frida is my name.
Why did Joe call the family member by the wrong name? Some minor details started to emerge. Soon after, the hearing for the International Space Station began. Investigation team leader Bonnie belonged to the Russian Space Agency. Everyone reviewed the space station footage together, and Joe quickly noticed something amiss. She clearly heard an alarm sound at the time of the impact, indicating that the system detecting space debris had issued a warning. But there were no alarm sounds in the surveillance footage, and the other 3 surviving astronauts also claimed not to have heard any. Bonnie said, "That makes it easy. Since it was an impact accident caused by the failure of the space debris detection system, the responsibility for all financial losses should be borne by the party providing that system, which is the United States." Then Joe raised another question. She saw the impact object during her spacewalk maintenance, and it was the body of a former Soviet cosmonaut. Bonnie immediately denied this possibility. How many years has it been since the dissolution of the Soviet Union? How is it possible to have a body floating in space debris for so long? Moreover, every Soviet cosmonaut is documented, and there has never been a male or female astronaut missing in outer space. Bonnie believes that Joe might have mistaken space debris for a female body due to oxygen deprivation in her brain. The hearing is temporarily interrupted at this point. Mark comes over to comfort Joe, and he was about to reach out and touch her cheek, but is repelled by Joe's disgust. Mark's face shows a puzzled expression. Afterwards, Joe returns to her accommodations to rest. She longs for her husband and tries to be close to him, but he responds very stiffly. Furthermore, Joe realizes that her daughter has completely forgotten the Swedish language she had learned. Strange occurrences continue to increase. Joe fell on the way to the re-examination. Surprisingly, she sees the door with bead markers again. Her husband hurriedly helps Joe back to their dormitory. Various emotions flood her mind. Joe takes off her coat and throws herself into her husband's arms. He bluntly says, "You've really changed a lot since you came back from space."
You look at me a bit differently.
Joe can't help but laugh at his words. She has always deeply loved her husband. So what kind of change is he talking about? On the other side, Gene is staring at the equipment data. He has seen these special substances before. They generate dual quantum signals at the moment of impact. Gene has been sitting in front of the computer for half a day, but the data on the screen hasn't changed at all. His assistant advises him not to waste any more time. However, Gene stubbornly persists in guarding the instrument. He was once an astronaut on Apollo 18, and lost 2 teammates during that mission. Gene's memory has been confused since he returned, but he firmly believes that he has seen the dual quantum signals. Gene waited until late at night. The signal finally appears. He immediately takes out his phone to capture, yet the camera fails to capture the fluctuating signal. Gene can only draw it with a pen. The next day, he shows the record to his assistant. The assistant says that Nobel Prizes cannot be obtained through drawing. The 2 of them didn't notice the device behind them. It emits a blue light once again. At that moment, Gene looks out the window. He sees Alice running into the building. Immediately after, a girl dressed exactly like Alice. She also carries a rabbit doll and follows inside. The first Alice who entered hides under the car. She plays hide and seek with John's daughter, Dani, but she sees the other girl stepping on her own rabbit doll. Angry Alice rushes out to stop her. Nevertheless, the girl from before disappears. Confused, she follows after. She happens to see Dani arriving with the doll. We can tell by their clothes. The one who followed into the garage earlier was not Dani, but Alice is unaware of the truth. She gets into an argument with Dani.
You can't just do anything just because your dad's dead. It should have been your mama. Your mom's a crazy bitch.
Alice picks up the rabbit doll. Unexpectedly, there are no stains on it. Could it be that she wrongly accused Dani? Right at that moment, Gene approaches to talk. He must have seen the situation through the window. Gene tells Alice, our understanding of the entire world is based on quantum physics. Later, with the emergence of Einstein and others, smaller particles were discovered, such as atoms, subatomic particles, and waveforms. This rendered classical physics theories inapplicable. The same object can exist in 2 different forms simultaneously. Let me give an example. In one world, particle A is black. In another world, it is white. And between these 2 worlds, there exists a threshold space. Within this space, particle A is both black and white. It can fluctuate between black and white until an observer appears. Gene invents a cold atom device and sends it to space. It is to simulate the threshold space and prove this point. However, only he has seen the experimental results. The next day, Joe and 3 surviving astronauts go together near John's grave. She is not shaken in seeing the corpse of the female cosmonaut. She even finds the style of the cosmonaut spacesuit. It is an early 1960s Star City uniform. Helen looks at the photos on her phone. She asks Joe if she doesn't know who this person is. She is the head of the investigation team, Bonnie. Joe is shocked upon hearing this. Soon, she experiences hallucinations again. She sees the deceased John standing in front of her. After this unexpected incident, Joe, in a later hearing, admits outright that what she saw was space debris. She now just wants to return to a normal life. Shortly after, Joe and her family return to their residence in Cologne, Germany. She asks her husband with some confusion, "When did you buy a new car? Wasn't our car red?" Her husband is puzzled. "My car has always been blue." On Gene's side, in the evening, Bonnie comes to visit with wine. It turns out they had performed space missions together. Their personal relationship was also very good. Bonnie says she has cancer. She now just wants to enjoy herself while she can. The 2 of them were planning to spend the spring morning together. Bonnie suddenly turns into a corpse. Almost at the same time, another Gene is chatting with a retired detective on the deck. They discuss the incident involving the Apollo mission. At that time, Gene suddenly fainted during the landing process. When he woke up, his 2 companions had mysteriously died. There were many unexplained doubts in this case. Therefore, the detective had always suspected that Gene had caused the deaths of his fellow astronauts. This statement completely angered Gene. Gene rushed forward and threw the detective into the sea. In the original universe, Joe's husband takes their daughter, Alice, to a cabin in Sweden. In their understanding, Joe has already died in outer space. At this moment, Alice stands in front of the wooden door, always feeling that opening the door will reveal her mother. On the other side, Joe has ended up in a parallel universe, having a meal with the family here. Her husband and daughter have thrown her a belated birthday party. During the party, Joe tells a Swedish joke, but her husband and daughter don't understand it at all. Then her husband wants to have a conversation with Joe.
Well, you didn't look at me when we said goodbye.
Joe is very puzzled upon hearing this. "We had a good relationship before I went to space." She goes to bed with some confusion. The next day, she wakes up early. Joe notices a photo on the table, showing herself teaching her daughter to play the piano. The problem is, Joe doesn't know how to play the piano. She sits at the piano, and her fingers instinctively hit the keys, producing musical notes. In the evening, Joe tries once again to communicate with Alice in Swedish, but the girl still doesn't understand a word. Joe goes to talk to her husband. She wants to understand the meaning behind his words from last night. Why did he think their relationship was bad? Her husband reveals the affair she had with Mark. Jo can't believe what she's hearing. She didn't even consider Mark a close colleague. How could she have had an affair? Her husband assumes that Jo doesn't want to admit it. He confesses that during this time, he also met someone he was dating, and he didn't think Jo would be upset about it, as they had already planned to divorce once this space mission was over. Jo is completely overwhelmed after listening to this. She had never thought about getting a divorce. Jo feels that this situation is very abnormal, and she goes to talk to the psychologist at the space agency. The doctor believes it is post-traumatic stress disorder, so the doctor prescribes lithium tablets for Jo, but this medication is enough to ruin an astronaut's career. She walks out of the office and runs into Gene. He invites Jo to visit the cold atom laboratory. Jo inadvertently glances at the whiteboard, noticing words like stress trauma, lithium-7, and phrases related to extraterrestrial death events. Gene asks Jo about surviving astronauts, if they have experienced any strange effects. Jo doesn't confess her recent situation. Gene changes the subject and tells Jo a story. A pilot's son tragically drowned, and several years later, while flying a DC-10 over Nevada, he unexpectedly hears the voice of his deceased son. "Dad, be careful." He realizes that the airplane is rapidly descending. Fortunately, the pilot manages to climb in time, averting disaster. He firmly believes that it was his son who saved him.
They don't say it, but that's the kind of thing that followed us into space.
Jo senses that there's more behind the old man's words, and she recalls the various hallucinations she experienced in the space station. Could it be that Gene has also encountered similar situations? At that moment, the cold atom machine suddenly emits light, and Jo feels a sharp pain in her left eye. Then a series of space station images flash by, and Jo in those images has her left eye bandaged. In the afternoon, she and her husband are called to their daughter's school, and the homeroom teacher reveals that Alice has been behaving strangely lately, often bringing up topics of death and accidents. There have also been a few incidents involving the cupboard.
She hides in cupboards.
Yeah.
Jo looks at the two of them speaking in unison, and she can't help but suspect her husband's date, who happens to be Alice's homeroom teacher. Jo returns home, only to find her daughter hiding in the cupboard again, with a string of beads hanging on the doorknob. This scene is remarkably similar to the hallucination she witnessed in space. Jo pulls Alice out of the cupboard.
You're not happy I'm back?
This can't go on like this. Jo suggests that the three of them go on a vacation to a cabin. They can use this time to repair their relationship. Meanwhile, Gene is video chatting with a professor from MIT. His cold atom experiment hasn't made any progress. It will have to be forcibly shut down by NASA. The purpose of cold atoms is to trap a particle, allowing it to exist in two states simultaneously. Gene clearly saw the data of the interference effect, but his phone couldn't capture it. Since the interference data cannot be recorded by the observer, Gene has to change his approach. It is known that the entire history of quantum physics is closely related to the observer effect. The observed phenomenon in experiments is influenced by the presence of the observer. So, is it possible that the experiment can also affect me? Scenes to verify Gene's speculation. At this moment, Jo hesitates as she sits in front of the piano. The beautiful music flows effortlessly from her hands. Someone who has never learned to play the piano inexplicably gains the ability to play. From this, it can be seen that Jo, through conscious quantum entanglement, has exchanged with her parallel universe self, while their physical bodies haven't switched. That's why she retains the muscle memory of the original pianist. On the cruise ship's side, in the previous episode, we saw two Genes appearing simultaneously in different scenes. One of them even pushed the retired detective into the sea. To distinguish between the two Genes, we will now rename them. Gene who busy with cold atom experiments will be renamed Henry, and Gene suspected of murder will be renamed Bud. At this point, the FBI has discovered the death of the retired detective. There were witnesses who saw, but calling the victim to the deck for a conversation. Therefore, the FBI has reasons to suspect Bud, but Bud immediately denies the suspicion of murder. He says, "I'm an astronaut. I've walked on the moon, and I got my shoulder injured in the Korean War. I don't have the strength to push down a grown man." As expected, the FBI officer checks, and indeed Bud has been to space. Nevertheless, the Apollo 18 mission he was on had an accident. The outside world suspects that Bud never actually landed on the moon. Then, the female police officer pulls up the cruise ship's surveillance footage. On the other hand, after Jo returns home, she is debating whether to take psychiatric medication. At that moment, she suddenly discovers that the lithium pills are the same as the vitamin B prescribed by her doctor. They are clearly the same medication. Jo angrily rushes to the space agency. She discovers that Henry is also there. He is not wearing glasses at the moment and is arguing with someone. But as the camera zooms in, Henry puts on his glasses again. Joe doesn't interrupt him. She goes to the laboratory and uses spectroscopy to analyze the two capsules. As expected, she finds that they are both lithium pills. Joe retrieves the medical records of the astronauts and discovers that any astronaut who experienced hallucinations or exhibited abnormal behavior was prescribed vitamin B by the doctors, and Henry is also on the list. The astronauts who exhibited normal behavior were prescribed vitamin A. At that moment, two staff members enter to tidy up things, but they seem to not notice Joe at all. They don't even spare her an extra glance. Joe tries to talk to the staff members. Little did they know, she didn't exist in their perspectives. What is going on here? Persistent Joe decides to approach them. Clearly, Joe and the staff members are not in the same universe, but Joe can briefly traverse the transit space of the AB universe under certain specific conditions. As Joe prepares to leave the space agency, Henry, without glasses, is still chatting with someone. Joe approaches him to say hello, but Henry remains focused on the computer, and the screen shows Henry wearing glasses.
Curiosity killed the cat.
Joe tries hard to ignore these strange occurrences. Next day, she goes to her daughter's school to give a lecture, and her husband keeps joking with the teacher. Joe can't help but shout, "Stay away from my husband." After the lecture, the family of 3 leaves the school. Logically, Joe has recently returned to Earth and shouldn't be driving for at least a few months, but she forcefully takes the keys from her husband. On the way, Alice wants to listen to music, but is refused by Joe, so she takes out her phone and plays some music. At this moment, Joe's left eye starts to ache faintly, and she even experiences hallucinations of the space station. She turns her head and scolds her daughter to turn off the music, almost colliding with a car coming from the opposite direction. After Mark learns about the events of the day, he comes home to talk to her husband. Mark suggests that Joe goes to the astronaut rehabilitation clinic, but their conversation veers off to the topic of extramarital affairs. Mark finally admits to having an affair with Joe, leading to a big argument among the 3 of them. Joe tries to explain that she truly doesn't remember her relationship with Mark, but her husband refuses to believe her. Joe angrily sweeps the documents off the table only to discover that they are recordings and transcripts sent by a private organization. The sender claims that these are the sounds Joe transmitted from the International Space Station on October 15th, even though the communication was supposedly cut off. In addition to this cassette tape, there is also an audio recording from November 23, 1967, indicating an accident in outer space that resulted in the death of a female cosmonaut. Upon hearing the sound from the cassette tape, Alice upstairs crawls out of the cupboard and goes downstairs, only to find people everywhere in the house, with Joe's memorial photo placed on the table. In this instance, the 2 universes overlap once again. The husband hears the sound and hurries downstairs, thinking Joe frightened their daughter, insisting on contacting Mark and sending his wife for treatment. An argument ensues, and Joe pushes her husband down. Joe immediately dials the emergency number and, after resolving the issues with her husband, she calls her daughter to go to the space agency. Joe wants to figure out why. If the control center could hear her distress call, there was no response at that time. Joe enters the space agency's office once again, intending to copy the audio data from the space station. As a result, she discovers that all the files are encrypted, except for a recording of her conversation with Alice before the collision event. At that time, Joe was explaining the principles of cold atom experiments to her daughter, but she has no recollection of saying those words. Joe decides to take the cold atoms with her. On the other side, Henry wakes up from the bed. Now back to normal, Henry rushes to the bathroom and writes "Leave me alone" on the foggy mirror. Surprisingly, but in the parallel universe sees this message, indicating that they are aware of each other's existence. The next day, Henry discovers that the cold atoms are missing, and he immediately contacts Bonnie to handle the matter. Meanwhile, Joe arrives at the Puttgarden ferry terminal and, while waiting for the security check, contacts her colleague at the space station, Ilya. She explains about the vitamin substitution at the space agency, and how the command center ignored her distress call.
They couldn't, Joe. I was there. They couldn't.
They're giving lithium pills to astronauts.
Joe asks Ilya to also test the vitamins he has been taking, and then Joe goes to have a meal with her daughter. Joe can't help but ask Alice why she hid in the cupboard, and her daughter says it's a method taught by Valia. Joe has never heard of this person, so she asks Alice to draw a picture of Valia. While her daughter is drawing, Joe takes the opportunity to make a phone call to the person who sent the cassette tape. The old man on the other end is surprised to learn Joe's identity, and says that the cassette tape was sent by his sister. Joe searches online for the grassroots organization that sent the package, and discovers that it is run by a brother and sister who have been convicted for forging cassette tapes. Could it be that she has been deceived? Just then, her daughter comes over with the drawing, and Joe is startled when she sees it. Isn't this the deceased Russian astronaut? She has never mentioned this to Alice before. Meanwhile, Ilya listens to Joe's instructions to conduct a drug test. Fortunately, Ilya's vitamin A is just a regular vitamin. Yet, Ilya becomes concerned about Joe's words, and wants to retrieve the medical records from that time. Upon hearing this, the administrator's face changes, and she walks aside to make a phone call. Later, she informs Ilya that the medical documents have been invalidated. Then Bonnie arrives at the scene, and asks Ilya why he is looking up medical records, and if he heard anything from Joe. Where is she now? Ilya evades the question. Meanwhile, Joe arrives at the Naval Observatory, and finds the Lorentz siblings who sent the cassette tape. As soon as they enter the room, they see a note with E8787 written on it. Joe briefly explains her reason for coming. She saw the body of a female cosmonaut in space, and that body was the cause of the collision incident at the International Space Station. Yet the space agency tried to manipulate Joe into lying, and even wanted to send her to a mental hospital. Fortunately, the cassette tape sent by the Lorentz siblings contains not only the sound after the communication was cut off, but also records of a Russian cosmonaut going missing. Joe suspects that this deceased cosmonaut is the body she saw, so she wants to know how the Lorentz siblings recorded these sounds. Lorentz explains that she and her brother are amateur who love capturing sounds from outer space. They have even been invited by the space agency. Joe knows she is not lying, because there is a photo of Commander Henry on the table. The Lorentz siblings tell Joe that Henry visited here in 1982. He wanted to take the recordings of Apollo 18. Joe is quite familiar with the Apollo incident. She heard that there was an accident during that mission, and Henry was the sole survivor. After returning, he became a heavy drinker and is completely different now. According to Joe's description, the person who became a heavy drinker should be Bud, so we can speculate that Bud and Henry have switched places. At this moment, Lorentz says that the only way to hear the voices on those ghostly cassette tapes clearly is by going out to sea. So she is preparing to take Joe out on a boat. Meanwhile, Alice quietly takes the phone from the table and follows her mother onto the boat. She takes out the phone and tries to unlock it. Finally, she uses the number 8787 written on a sticky note to unlock the phone, but there is no signal at sea. On the other side, Lorentz is explaining that the clearest sound can be heard 8 kilometers offshore. Once the boat reaches a specific threshold area, Lorentz plays the cassette tape from 1967 again. She also mentions that Bonnie went into outer space on the same day, but she safely returned to Earth. In fact, from this, it can be deduced that the Soviet female corpse floating in space is likely another version of Bonnie from a different universe. After listening to this cassette tape, Lorentz asks Joe what other tapes she would like to listen to, and also suggests listening to John's tape. Joe refutes and says that John has been dead for a long time.
I heard him. And I also heard him.
Sorry, but no, you didn't.
No wonder Lorentz was surprised when she received Joe's call, because she and her sister thought the deceased person in the recording was Joe, not John. The situation becomes more and more mysterious, and Joe doesn't want to listen any further. She quickly leaves with her daughter. As soon as Alice reaches the shore, she calls her father and tells him that something is not right with her mother. She says they are heading to the small cabin near Vindel River. Joe prepares to leave with her daughter, and Lorentz hands them a large bundle of cassette tapes. While the mother and daughter are driving to the cabin, Alice plays the cassette tape again, and unexpectedly, the audio becomes exceptionally clear. Alice recognizes it as Valia's voice. Joe abruptly hits the brakes upon hearing this. She tries to bring the radio closer to the cold atoms, and the sound indeed becomes clearer. Joe is puzzled about how her daughter could recognize the Soviet female corpse. The car quickly arrives near Vindel River. Joe drives into the forest, but two diverging paths appear in front of her, which contradicts her memory. Joe decides to drive across the frozen lake. After arriving at the cabin, Joe suddenly hears her daughter's voice, but Alice falls asleep in the car at the moment. Joe plays the recording given by the Lorentz siblings, and in the audio, she is having a video call with her daughter in space, and both of them are speaking Swedish. Just then, Alice was awakened by the recording.
That was not me. I don't speak Swedish.
There is another small detail in this part. Alice keeps calling Joe a mommy, but the girl in the recording calls her mom. The scene shifts, and another Alice appears. Joe hears the voice and goes outside to search. This is the scene from the first episode where Joe hears a voice and goes out to find her daughter. The scene returns to the International Space Station, but this time it's not John who dies, but Joe. You might be confused at this point. What exactly is happening? We can assume that there are two parallel universes in the movie, referred to as Universe A and Universe B, due to a space accident. These two universes intersect. Joe from Universe A accidentally enters Universe B and manages to return to Earth alive. But in Universe B, her husband and Alice are not her family from original world, so her daughter doesn't speak Swedish, and the car at home has turned blue. On the other hand, Joe from Universe B, after entering Universe A, has tragically died due to the collision event. In Universe A, the one who survives is actually John. Upon hearing the news of her mother's tragic death, Alice hides in the cupboard and refuses to come out. She keeps kicking the cupboard with her toes. Unexpectedly, a beam of light shines from outside, which is the scene where Joe sees her daughter hiding in the cupboard from the space station. At this moment, John is preparing to return to Earth. He is afraid that the wounds on Joe's body would burst under the pressure of re-entry, so he decides to leave the body on the space station.
Stop breathing, Joe. You stay in destiny.
This passage is about the mysterious recording that a universe's Joe hears at the space station.
I'm sorry.
The story forms a perfect loop at this point. The various accidents and illusions experienced by Joe A at the space station are a result of the superposition of the two universes. When John returns to Earth, he also encounters a bolt malfunction that requires dual-person activation. In the overlapping state of the two universes, he and Joe A inadvertently help each other solve the problem, and successfully board escape pods to return to Earth. Yet, they end up in the wrong universe. When John returns to Earth, he immediately calls his wife by the wrong name. This indicates that his experience is identical to Joe's, except John's consciousness has shifted from Universe B to Universe A. After landing, John visits Joe's family and explains why he didn't bring back her body. Heartbroken, Alice A runs out of the house and angrily stomps on the rabbit doll, which is the reason why Universe B's Alice, hiding in the garage, sees someone stepping on her doll. Apart from that, the biggest difference between the two universes is the presence or absence of the cold atom experiment. Let's briefly return to the scene from the first episode when Joe was video chatting with her daughter. In the previous moment, Alice had double ponytails, and they were discussing lettuce cultivation, and John in the background hadn't conducted the cold atom experiment. But in the next moment, Alice had a single ponytail, and their conversation topic shifted to cold atoms. So, from the beginning of the series, the plot we see is interwoven between the two universes. While in the A universe where Joe is, there is no existence of cold atoms. So when the command center asked her to retrieve the cold atom device in the first episode, Joe's initial response was unclear. Although she obeyed the command and brought the cold atom back to Universe B, she was still unclear about what it was. Now back to John's side. He was originally from Universe B, so he was familiar with the cold atom experiment. Yet, during the hearing in Universe A, colleagues pointed out that the cold atom experiment had been discontinued 12 years ago, and Bonnie was not present at the press conference. John also couldn't find Commander Henry, because in this world there was no Henry, only Bud. Although John returned home alive, he felt unable to regain his connection with his family. He and Joe were like two misplaced chess pieces, unable to fit into the misaligned world. Shortly after, Joe's family in Universe A held a funeral for her, and the threshold space where the two universes overlapped reappeared. Alice in Universe A saw another version of herself, and her mother in Universe B, so she decided to visit her mother's cabin. As a result, heavy snow blocked the only path, and the father wanted to take Alice to a nearby hotel for lodging, but the little girl insisted on crossing the frozen lake to reach the cabin. Alice always had a feeling that her mother was still alive, and would definitely come to the cabin to find her. Alice was awakened by the sound of an engine in the middle of the night. She crawled to the window to see, and discovered her mother outside the cabin. The two universes overlapped once again, and on the other side, John was determined to uncover the truth. He drove to Bud's apartment, and saw a report about Apollo 18 on his wall. The news stated that the mission had completely failed, with only Bud surviving. This description perfectly matched Joe's account of the Apollo 18 incident. But in John's universe, Henry successfully fixed the issues with Apollo, and led the team safely back to Earth. Therefore, John couldn't understand why the newspaper was reporting inaccurately, and he was even more puzzled about why the respected commander was hiding in this rundown apartment.
You tell me why you're here.
You tell me, why the fuck are you?
Alice A immediately ran out of the door to check, and found her mother was gone. She stood in place and called out loudly, and Joe in Universe B heard the voice. She looked at the sleeping Alice B in the car with confusion, thinking she was having a hallucination. Meanwhile, Alice A got dressed and went out to search for her mother. While Joe was chatting with Alice B. The other person pointed out that the voice inside didn't belong to her, because Alice, B, couldn't speak Swedish, and she hadn't talked to her mother about space letters. Alice, B, remembered clearly that they were discussing the cold atom experiment. Jo was greatly disturbed upon hearing this, because she had no recollection of the cold atom experiment before the accident. It was Henry who informed Jo that the device was primarily used to capture quantum superposition, enabling an object to exist in two places simultaneously. Alice picked up another cassette tape. It contained the audio transmitted back to Earth a day after the accident at the space station. Inside, John was reporting Jo's death, explaining that they couldn't transport the body back. Jo understood by this point that she had entered another world. Alice in front of her was not her own daughter, and vice versa. The other party shared the same feeling. Both of them were willing to uncover the truth together. Late at night, just as Jo had finished setting up the cold atom device, she heard Alice, A, calling out to her. She glanced at Alice, B, sleeping in the house, and walked into the heavy snow. On the other side, Alice, A, unexpectedly found another wooden house, which appeared to be very dilapidated. She took out a key and opened the door, discovering a small cat inside the house. There was also a demonic painting hanging on the wall. The painting depicted two men carrying a cooking demon, and moving forward, Alice continued exploring, and another painting appeared on the wall, showing an angel standing next to a boiler. Alice went upstairs, hung a string of beads on the cupboard, and then climbed into it. Unexpectedly, the cupboard door got locked, and Alice couldn't get out. Fortunately, Jo heard her daughter's cry for help, and entered the wooden house. Finding Alice, A, they were the real mother and daughter, both fond of wearing hats. Jo carried her daughter back to her own wooden house, and started running water for her bath. Unexpectedly, the hot water ran out halfway, so Jo left the bathroom to heat more water. In the mirror, Jo looked at the bedroom with confusion. Alice, B, was sleeping inside, and behind Jo, there was a painting titled Injured Angel, depicting two individuals carrying an angel forward. This painting was the real existence in reality. The two Alices stayed in separate rooms. Jo hesitated for a moment and walked towards the bathroom. Unexpectedly, Alice, B, called out to her, while at the same time, Alice, A, walked out of the bathroom. Alice, A, couldn't see her mother in front of her, only her father rushing over and asking where she had been. At that moment, behind Jo's husband, there was a painting titled Devil by the Roasting Pan. This painting also exists in reality. By observing the difference in the paintings hung in the two wooden houses, we can deduce, in the bedroom of one side, there is a painting of Injured Angel, indicating the A universe. In the bedroom of the other side, there is a painting of Devil by the Roasting Pan, indicating the B universe. In the previous old wooden house, there were two paintings hung, one in the front and one in the bedroom. These paintings altered the main elements of Injured Angel and Devil by the Roasting Pan, and were not real artworks. There was even a live cat inside the house. Which universe does this additional wooden house belong to? We need to continue watching to find out. Returning to the A universe, Alice tells her father that she saw her mother alive. However, Jo's husband refuses to believe it, and thinks their daughter is delusional due to the cold. Meanwhile, in the B universe, Jo realizes that her daughter is missing from the bathroom. She quickly helps Alice, B, put on warm clothes, and prepares to return to the previous old wooden house to find Alice, A. Here, we can see that Alice, B, is wearing a blue knitted hat, which is completely different from the style of the mother and daughter in the A universe. On the other side, Jo's husband, Mark, and Henry from the B universe are also on their way, trying to retrieve a cold atom device. Little did they know, fallen trees block their path, and they dare not drive over the lake. They wait at the current location. Meanwhile, Alice, B, in the B universe is confused about whom Jo is looking for. As she walks, she leaves a trail of beads on the ground as markers. She cautiously reminds Jo, "Are you seeing an illusion?" Jo explains to Alice, B, "You are not my daughter." Alice is stunned and asks, "You're not my mom. Then who is my mom?" After saying that, she snatches the cold atom device and runs away. Fearful Alice, B, wants to find her father, so she throws away the cold atom device and runs far away. Jo has no choice but to chase after her. Meanwhile, on the other side, Alice, A, is convinced that she just encountered her mother. After her father falls asleep, she puts on her hat and sets off again. Alice, A, hasn't gone far when she sees the bead markers on the snowy ground. She follows the beads and unexpectedly discovers the cold atom device. However, Alice, A, doesn't recognize this thing at all. When Joey's husband wakes up, he realizes his daughter is missing again. He hastily puts on his coat and goes out to search for her. On the other side with Alice, B, she also discovers an old wooden house. Alice, B, pushes the door open and sees a dead cat lying on the ground. Moreover, the positions of the two paintings are different from the ones Alice, A, are found in the old wooden house. Alice, B, notices a radio on the table and takes it upstairs. She discovers a bead necklace hanging on the cupboard. At the same time, Alice, A, returns to the old wooden house. Just as Alice, B, hides in the cupboard with a flashlight, the light accidentally shines outside through the window, hurting Alice, A's eyes. Is there someone on the second floor? Alice, A, immediately enters the old wooden house, and upon opening the door, she sees a lively and playful kitten. She cautiously walks up to the second floor and discovers a radio inside the cupboard. Soon after, the voice of Alice, B, comes through, and even though the two girls are not in the same old wooden house, they can communicate through the radio. The scene shifts back to the adult side, where Joe and Joey's husband haven't found the children, and can only return to their respective wooden houses to investigate. Then, even stranger things happen. They both hear their daughter's voices coming from the second floor, so they rush up to investigate. They discover the radio inside the cupboard, and they can hear the conversation between the two Alice.
Is there a mirror there? Yes.
The two Alice agree to look into the mirror together. As a result, they accidentally lock the cupboard door. Joe and Joey's husband quickly rush downstairs upon hearing this. Joey's husband searches for their daughter while calling the police. At the same time, he also discovers a flashlight on the ground. Joey's husband speculates that their daughter might have gone to the other side of the lake. Joe puts down the kerosene lamp and hurriedly drives to the other side of the lake. She knows that Alice is most likely trapped in the old wooden house. Suddenly, a gust of cold wind blows into the house, causing the kerosene lamp to fall and ignite the carpet. Meanwhile, inside the cupboard of the old wooden house, the two Alice see each other through the mirror. They exchange information, and Joe overhears their conversation through the recording device. She hears Alice, B, ask, "Do you live with your mom?"
We can't. Why not? Because she's dead.
Upon hearing this, Joe quickly hits the brakes, not fully understanding the meaning of the words, and sees the wooden house behind her on fire. Joe immediately turns back to extinguish the fire, and Alice, B, vaguely realizes that it was her own mother who died when she hears Alice, A, say so.
What colour's your car? Red.
Indeed, Alice, B, guessed correctly, and she shares her speculation with the other Alice.
Is that you?
At this moment, Joe returns to the outside of the burning wooden house. Only to find that the flames that were burning just moments ago have disappeared. Joe looks at the wall and notices that the hanging painting is translucent like a mirror, and inside it, a world is ablaze. At this moment, a small cat runs to the corpse of its fellow. Joe walks upstairs in confusion, opens the cupboard, and sees Alice, B, wearing a blue hat. She also sees her real daughter through the mirror, but they cannot communicate directly, so they can only communicate through Alice, B. At this point, we need to organize the plot. In this episode, there are a total of 2 new wooden house and 2 old wooden houses. The new wooden houses with realistic paintings represent 2 main universes, A and B. The old wooden houses with altered paintings represent the world inside the mirror. The mirror world with a live cat corresponds to Universe A, while the mirror world with a dead cat corresponds to Universe B. The small wooden houses serve as a threshold space, where infinite universes overlap at a singularity. It's similar to the closed box in Schrodinger's cat, where entering the wooden house is equivalent to opening the box. The life or death of the cat corresponds to the 2 universes. To avoid complicating the storyline further, let's focus on the 2 main threads, A and B. At this moment, Joe B's husband and others bring the police to clear the way. During this time, he asked Henry why he came here. Henry began to talk about the accident of Apollo 18. At that time, he was in the command module, preparing to return to Earth. Unexpectedly, after entering the 16th hour of the return journey, a depressurization accident occurred inside the capsule. 2 astronauts died on the spot. Henry also lost consciousness. To his surprise, when he regained consciousness, a miracle happened. Both astronauts were perfectly fine, but Henry's memories had problems. He had to take lithium pills for an extended period. This segment also confirmed the switch between Henry and Bud. The police quickly moved the obstructing tree, but Henry didn't follow the majority, and went in another direction. He walked towards the light. As a result, he stumbled upon the cold atom device. Henry was about to leave with the device, when he accidentally saw Universe A where Bud was present. He also heard John's voice. Meanwhile, the fire was spreading inside the wooden house. It was about to reach from the mirror to reality. Joe had no choice but to carry Alice, B, downstairs. At the same time, Henry arrived outside the door. The conversation between John and Bud flashed back in his mind. Henry rushed forward and kicked open the wooden door.
Why the fuck are you here?
Surprisingly, the two old men had switched back. Joe handed Alice B to Bud. She rushed back to save Alice A. Just as Henry regained his senses, he saw himself shooting John. As for Bud, he had no idea who Alice was. He simply threw the girl into the snow. Inside the house, Joe couldn't find a way to rescue her daughter. She could only leave the wooden house for now. She discovered Alice B lying on the ground. Hastily, she ran over to provide first aid. Unexpectedly, Alice A appeared. After struggling with her decision, Joe decided that saving lives was the priority. She asked her daughter to go back and find her father, A.
But I'm your Alice.
What, Papa?
At this moment, Joey's husband arrived. He faintly saw his wife's figure, but as the police, B, approached, the two universes completely separated. Alice A returned to her father's side, while Alice B received timely medical attention and avoided any harm. During her unconscious state, she had a dream. She dreamt that her deceased sister, Valia, reached out her hand and said she could take her to meet their mother. Just as she finished speaking, Alice B woke up. She asked her father where her mother had gone. She learned that Joe had been taken away by Bonnie. After Alice B was discharged from the hospital, she decided to have a talk with her father, regardless of whether he believed it or not. It was necessary for her father to know the truth. However, an ordinary person couldn't accept such a truth. So, both husbands of Joe in the A and B worlds were undergoing psychological counseling, one because he saw his deceased wife in the snow, and the other because of the nonsense his daughter spoke. Joe B's husband had a scar on his head, which was from being pushed down by Joe before. It appeared for the first time here. The mirrored symmetrical image in the same room officially indicated that these were two universes. On the other side, Bud, who crossed from the A world, the first thing he did upon waking up was to destroy the cold atom device. The destruction of this device signified the interruption of the connection between the two universes. Then Bud pinned the blame on Joe, accusing her of destroying the device. Mark looked at the unreliable commander. Doesn't he care about the cold atom experiment anymore?
What? It's a thing. We got lives to live.
As for Henry, things were not going well for him. Not only was he facing charges for shooting John, but he also had to face trial for the murder of the former detective. Henry requested a DNA test to prove that he and Bud were not the same person. If the two worlds were mirror images of each other, then their DNA helix directions would be different for sure. But what Henry didn't know was, they only exchanged their conscious minds, and their physical bodies did not switch. So, the test results showed that their DNA profiles were identical. On the other side, Bud found the former detective in the B world, and discovered that he was still alive, but was quite satisfied with the current situation. He was no longer an alcoholic, but a respected commander. Although this world belonged to Bud from the beginning, the achievements in the cold atom field over the past few decades were actually the result of Henry's efforts. They both stole half of each other's lives. One took the earlier years, and the other took the later years. It could be considered a kind of fairness in a way. Meanwhile, Joe was taken to the mental hospital under Bonnie's supervision. During Joe's medical examination at the hospital, it was discovered that she is 4 weeks pregnant. The father of the child is Joe's B husband. Joe's ultrasound image is very strange, resembling the patterns observed in interference of cold atomic devices. Could it be that this fetus will become a new medium linking two universes? In addition, Joe's condition is also abnormal. Her left eye's pupil reacts normally to light, while her right eye shows no response to light, meaning she is likely connected to the deceased Joe B in space through a partial displacement. After completing a comprehensive set of tests, she is about to go back and see her daughter, referring to her daughter Alice. Unexpectedly, Bonnie tells her the news of her pregnancy.
I can't have this child. If I have this child, how will I get back?
Midway through her words, Joe suddenly hears a strange voice, and immediately, Bonnie in front of her transforms into Valia. She recognizes her as the Soviet female corpse from space. Upon hearing this, Bonnie hurriedly pushes Joe away and leaves. Then she calls Henry. In the evening, the two meet in a restaurant, but explains that he is not Henry. I know you are not Bonnie either. You are Valia, who should have died in space.
And you can keep on denying it and covering it up just like you always have.
On the other side, Ilya goes to the mental hospital to visit Joe. Joe sees her old friend. She tries to explain that she and Bonnie don't belong to this universe, but Ilya says Joe is sick, filled with unrealistic fantasies. Joe gets very angry upon hearing this, and is about to kick Ilya out, but the man secretly slips a key into her hand, and then meaningfully glances at the surveillance cameras. Late at night, Joe quietly retrieves the key from under the mattress, and unlocks a door, searching for an exit, only to unexpectedly discover a secret room, where two identical people are locked inside. Joe runs back to her room in fear. Various problems are difficult to tackle, pushing her to the brink of collapse. Meanwhile, the two Alice from different worlds are chatting with John's daughter. Even though they don't understand quantum mechanics, the girls clearly feel the changes in their family. Alice B knows convincing her dad is not easy, so she gives up on the truth. She says she wants to visit her mom at the hospital. Jo's B husband says when the time is right, they will definitely meet her mom. After saying that, he hands a box to Alice. It contains items packed from the cabin. Alice B opens it to look, and finds the tape recorder that can make calls. She tries to turn it on. Unexpectedly, she hears the voice of Alice A, but this time, Alice B doesn't respond. Alice A waits but doesn't hear a response. She can only leave with her father. They are about to move out of this house, and start a new life again. Alice A's thoughts are innocent. Another Alice exists in the world. If mom chooses to stay there, she won't be angry about it. She just wants her mom to be happy.
Am I brave?
You're incredibly brave.
Meanwhile, Joe at the mental hospital is sitting by the piano playing and singing. She seems to realize she must make compromises and accept the fate that has brought her to this world. Shortly after, Bonnie comes to see her and wants Joe to give up searching for the truth and focus on raising the soon-to-be-born child.
It cannot be undone. You cannot change it.
In fact, this makes some sense. Joe's original physical body is already dead. Her hope of returning is too faint. The next day, Alice A comes to see her. The little girl tells Joe, "We both lost a loved one, but we also found another loved one. But that doesn't mean we have to forget our original loved ones. It just means we have to accept the reality."
I need a mummy.
I need an Alice.
Just as the protagonist has decided to accept fate, Bonnie opens the ultrasound image. Two embryos are faintly visible in the image. Meanwhile, in a distant international space station, B-World's Joe wakes up. Just as Jo's A pupil reflects half dead, her body comes half alive. The story of this season concludes here. The subtitle of episode 8 is taken from The Wasteland, a long poem published by T.S. Eliot in 1922. These fragments I have shored against my ruins, meaning those scattered fragments that support oneself from being destroyed. For Joe entering another universe, these fragments are her original memories, and scattered fragments of her husband and daughter will support her life in an unfamiliar universe. Constellation is definitely an outstanding sci-fi film. Apart from its astonishing setting and intricately woven universe swapping, the film captures the complex relationship between the two Alice and Joe, depicted in a very nuanced and profound manner. Audiences who enjoy science fiction definitely should not miss this excellent work.